Welcome to Unit 1. In this unit, we will be reviewing transaction cost economics. My name is Dara Snyder-Jans, and I will be your narrator for this presentation. In this presentation, I will use seminal research to define the basics of transaction cost economics, describe specific assumptions of the theory, discuss some of the criticisms and critiques of this theory, and then discuss applied research. Transaction cost economics is a frequently used theory in supply chain management, but particularly popular in supplier relationship management research, where we focus on transactions between buyers and suppliers. Keep in mind that in transaction cost economics, the basic unit of analysis is transactions. Transactions, more specifically, are typically defined in supply chain management as a good or service being transferred across an organizational boundary. Of course, you can have both intra-organizational transactions, or movement of goods or services or communication within an organization, or inter-organizational transactions, which is the movement of goods or services or communication between buyer and supplier. The central idea behind transaction cost economics is that organizations change because managers seek to economize their transaction costs. This is specified by Williamson 1985 in his paper. Organizations perform best when they use governance structures that are least expensive as possible. Firms with lower transaction costs are better performers than are firms with higher transaction costs. There are a variety of ways in which transaction costs can be defined. Two seminal research papers in transaction cost economics have defined them as follows. First, costs involved in negotiating, monitoring, and enforcing contracts is a definition provided by Hill in his 1999 paper. Or Williamson, in his famous 1985 definition, names it as costs of planning, adapting, and monitoring task completion. One assumption is that transactions differ by the degree to which each party's, for example, buyer or supplier, relationship-specific assets are involved. They can also differ in terms of the amount of uncertainty about the other party's actions and about the future in general, or the complexity of the trading agreement, as well as frequency from which transactions occur. These differences help a firm decide which governance structures are preferable, which leads us to asset specificity. Asset specificity refers to the extent to which assets that support a transaction are tailored to it. There are four types of asset specificity according to Williamson. The first one is site. This asset specificity includes highly immobile assets that remain in place to save transportation and inventory cost. The second is physical. This is equipment to machinery that are specific to this relationship. The third is human or human capital that can include employee education and training that is specific to this particular relationship. The last one is dedicated asset specificity. This includes substantial investments that were made only for a particular transaction and have no value outside of this transaction. When one party has a highly specific asset, this can trigger opportunistic behaviors. For example, if a company relies on a single supplier for one of its parts, that company may try to opportunistically charge the company a very high price for that item. At the same time, the company might try to underpay the supplier, knowing that the supplier has no other market for that item. Well-written and well-negotiated contracts can head off of this problem. This ties into the other assumption of transaction cost economics that humans always act opportunistically, meaning with self-interest and without morality. Transactions must then be governed, designed, and carried out by institutional arrangements or contracts between firms, while at the same time keeping in mind that top management will seek to economize these costs. As with every theory, there will always be critiques and criticisms. Some of the criticisms and critiques for the transaction cost economics are as follows. First, there is a lack of consensus regarding key terms and concepts in this theory. Inconsistencies and difficulties include measuring such terms as opportunism, asset specificity, and uncertainty. This makes it very difficult for scholars to interpret results among various studies. Second, the assumption that humans always behave opportunistically, meaning with self-interest and without morality. This assumption is highly questionable, as it purports a common misconception that all buyer and supplier relationships are adversarial in nature, and hence transactions must always be governed by harshly specific contracts, because trading partners will always be out to harm each other. Third, Goschel and Moran in their 1996 paper argued that there are self-fulfilling prophecy problems with transaction cost theory. Opportunism is always possible and often can't be predicted, hence it must always be expected. As a result, trading partners must always distrust each other and create contracts with as many controls as possible so that there will be enhanced behavior from both trading parties. Fourth, critics have argued that transaction cost economics theory is biased towards benefits of integration and explicit contract safeguards. The theory has not been able to explain anomalies or situations where organizations can exist quite successfully without typical governance structures. Now let's discuss some of the research conducted in transaction cost economics. Seminal works in transaction cost economics were Williamson 1985, Williamson 2002, and Williamson 2010. Williamson is considered the father of transaction cost economics and is a Nobel laureate. His most famous article in the 1980s helped to define transaction cost economics. His most recent works focus on defense. Transaction cost theory originally focused on the dichotomy between make it or buy it. Now, more research is focusing on collaborative relationships called relational governance or alliances. For example, Carr and Pearson, 1999, attempted to answer the question of whether or not supplier relationship management increases performance. How do we enhance supplier relationship management? And the differences in these relationships between small and large firms was critical in assessing this question. Autry and Golisic, 2010, attempted to address the cyclical relationship between performance and supplier relationship using a longitudinal method. Finally, Brinkoff et al., 2014, looked and analyzed interorganizational trust and supplier relationship management. Congratulations, now you know more about transaction cost economics and its applied research.